제3회가 되는 아시안 필름 앤 비디오 아트 포럼이 어제 개막을 하고 오늘 3시에 리서치 앤 렉처 첫 번째 렉처 임철민 그리고 김상숙 두 분의 렉처가 있었고요. 그리고 이제 두 번째 그 렉처는 인도의 락스미디어 콜렉티브 그룹의 멤버이신 슈드하브라타 생굽타 님이 나오셔서 렉처를 진행해 주시겠습니다. 아시는 분들은 아시겠지만은 또 모르시는 분들도 있으실 것 같아서 락스미디어 콜렉티브의 슈드하브라타 생굽타 님과 관련해서 간단하게 소개를 해드리겠습니다. 락스미디어 콜렉티브는 1992년에 모니카 나룰라, 또 지베시 바그치, 슈드하브라타 생굽타 이렇게 3명이 결성한 콜렉티브 워크를 하는 그런 그룹입니다. 주로 리서치에 기반해서 다양한 장르 예술을 접목하는 그런 작업을 기획 또 수행하고 있습니다. 락스 미디어 콜렉티브의 이 락스는 페르시아어 또 아랍어 및 우르두어로 된 단어이고 이게 뭐 소용돌이 칠 때 소용돌이 치는 사람이 들어온 상태를 의미한다고 합니다. 저도 잘은 모르지만은요. 또 춤에 사용되는 단어이기도 하고 뭐 질문의 약자일 수 있다고도 합니다. 인도 델리에 위치한 이 그룹은 미디어와 비판적 이론 또 이론적 탐구 또 미적 담론을 통해서 예술적인 실천을 시도하고 있습니다. 또 우주에 대한 철학적 질문이라든가 역사적 질문과 함께 일상의 문제들을 연구하고 있습니다. 락스미디어 콜렉티브의 그 주요 관심사 중 하나는 도시에 대한 연구인데요. 도시에 대한 조사는 건축적인 관심사에만 국한되지 않고 사적이고 공공적이고 또 사회 및 경제 요인을 포함하고 있습니다. 브뤼셀의 빨레데 보자르에서 처음으로 선보였던 웨어하우스 2004년인데요. 이때 전시 이후로도 꾸준히 개인전 또 그룹전에 참여를 했고요. 이분들의 작업은 전시 공간 설치에만 국한되지 않고 델리의 개발 사회 연구센터인 사라이와 공동으로 웹사이트 또 뭐 회의라든가 출판물 연구를 진행하고 있습니다. 다양한 분야의 전문가 및 학자와 공동 설립한 연구그룹이라고 할 수 있는 사레이는 미디어 연구실이라고 부를 수도 있고요. 또 정기적으로는 학제간 저널인 사레이 리더를 제작하면서 토론을 위한 플랫폼의 역할을 하고 있습니다. 지난 10년 동안 락스미디어 콜렉티브는 아티스트이자 큐레이터로서 2002년 도큐멘타 11과 베니스, 이스탄불, 타이페이, 리버풀, 시드니, 상파울루 등의 비엔날레 작품을 전시했고요. 또 이들의 작품은 뽕피스 센터, 테이트 브리튼, 또 아트 언리미티드, 모리미술관, 서펜타인 갤러리 등에서 소개가 됐습니다. 네, 제가 연도는 정확히 못 외워서 2008년이네요. 런던 서펜타인 갤러리에서 시작됐던 인디언 하이웨이를 기획했었고요. 또 제7회 마니페스타인 The Last of Now, 또 Step Away from Oblivion이라는 망각에서 벗어난 단계라는 전시를 기획했었습니다. 매년 세계 곳곳에서 큐레이터로서 참여하는 이들은 2016년 상하이 비엔날레 수석 큐레이터였고요. 또 현재 2020년 요코하마 트리엔날레 예술 총감독으로서 준비에 굉장히 바쁘신 와중입니다. 그런 와중에 저희 이번 이미지 소비 시대의 황혼이라는 전반적인 예술과 또 예술 행동에 대한 것들을 생각하고자 하는 이번 기획 프로그램 취지에 동감을 하신 면이 많으셔서 락스미디어 콜렉티브의 슈드하브라타 생굽타 님이 기꺼이 강연을 해주시기로 했고요. 그동안에 작업하셨던 경험을 바탕으로 해서 비디오 협업이란 어떤 것이며 어떤 의미를 지니고 있고 또 연구 형태로서의 비디오 아트에 대해서 평소에 가지고 계신 그런 생각들을 이야기해 드리겠습니다. 그러면 슈드하브라타 생굽타님 소개해 드리겠습니다. 박수 부탁드려요.
Thank you, Yoonhee. Am I audible at the back? Yeah? Okay. Thank you, Yoonhee, Kim, and Kim Ji-hye, and everyone here at the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art at Seoul. It's a great pleasure for me to be here as a part of this forum and to learn a lot about practices in this part of the world and what you're thinking about. As Yoon-hee mentioned in her very generous introduction, we're a practice which has been sort of kicking around for a while now. And over the years, there's a series of notes and annotations and thinking about working, about what video does to our minds that I'm going to be trying to share with you this evening. So this will be in the form of a set of readings that I will do. So excuse me if I read, and because I think that saves time and offers more opportunities for discussion afterwards. So sometime in the late 1990s, oops, right. Sometime in the late 1990s, when the Rux Media Collective was still very young, so that's the black and white photograph, 20th century. 27 years later, which is how long we've been working together, we like to think that we're still very young, but you know, there's been some gray hair since then. We had written an essay on the place of research in documentary film practice, and the reason why I say that is because we were trained as filmmakers, as documentary filmmakers, so it's very interesting for me to be here within this context where the presence of filmmaking itself is a strong reason for us to think about art. We became artists sort of by accident. So this essay on research in documentary film practice, when I began reading it in preparation for coming here, seems very resonant today, even though we ourselves have moved a great distance from the kind of work that we used to do as documentary filmmakers. Reading it again makes us reconsider the role of research in the making of art. In the passage that follows, taken from the essay Frames of Mind, we retrieve once again the shaman as a practitioner in art and as a practitioner of research. I was having a conversation earlier today with Park Chan-kyung and was curious about his interest in shamanism, and it seemed very resonant to me that I was going to make a little foray into thinking about shamans today. So what is it that distinguishes the attentiveness of the documentarist at work from the attention that all of us pay to the world in an everyday sense? What marks the difference between two acts of looking at life? Perhaps a tentative answer to this question could be, it is the porous line that separates looking from looking again at the world. And I want to show you here a little snapshot of what looking again at the world means on an everyday level for us. This is a diagram of the conversation or the traffic between the three of us, myself, Jibesh, and Monica, on one afternoon in Delhi, in our studio, across a table, a little larger than this. We sit with our three computers, and the world pours into our computers and pours out of us at each other. So this diagram is actually a diagram just of word frequencies, of traffic, of data transmissions between computers, and it sort of creates a picture of a conversation. And being a collective that has worked for 27 years, I can say that our practice's main foundation is conversational. And that includes a huge amount of disagreement. We fight every day. So, and the conversation archives the disagreements. And it is the disagreements that become the motor or the engine of the practice in a way. So we got a friend of ours who's a software programmer to create this snapshot of what was going on between our computers, and it became an excuse for making a little video to teach ourselves what we were doing with our practice. And it's basically, if you like, a way of talking to anybody, or we could say everybody in the world. My friend Jibesh likes to say that the reason why we make art is because we have to talk to 7 billion people one at a time. That's the reason for making art. Or it could be talking to nobody in particular, or antibodies. And it's that mesh of conversational practice, of arguments, of disagreements, of storytelling, anecdotes, jokes, that constitutes the anchor and the backdrop of what the daily act of research is. Interestingly, this pattern of lines and connections and like a spider web of relationships became a part of a work that we did in Korea in the public art project at Anyang, where we used this conversational matrix to quote the interiors of a subway train and had actors do performances that in some ways marked and commemorated the uprisings for democracy in Korea in the 1970s and 80s, and the way in which conversation itself became a fulcrum of democratic practices. But let me not stray from the question of what is research. Perhaps a tentative answer to this question of what makes the difference between looking and looking as an artist for us is, it is the porous line that separates looking from looking again at the world. And that's a pretty obvious question. It is this line which also separates our negotiations as individuals from our engagements as filmmakers, and now I would say artists. It separates looking and searching within our field of vision from the acts of looking again, searching again, from research. Can we then suggest that the act of research is always an invisible and silent corollary to the act of filming, that which we look at anyway? If we remove from the word research its respectable institutional connotations, its images of white-coated investigators in laboratories, or the ethnographer, hunter-gatherer of facts in the field, can the word research then be claimed as a significant motivation for all those who have gambled with the real every time they let light into their lens? Can documentary filmmakers or artists then be seen as the last living claimants of the heritage of shamans, rather than as visual anthropologists who make shamans the object of their study, by virtue of their pursuit of a second sight within the sphere of the real and the peopled and ordinary and material world? These actors that walked through the trains also wore these masks that are a part of Korean folk drama, where people get possessed by spirits as they perform. So it was as if the face was always prepared to become the mask of the possessed individual. Can we then make the imaginative leap to say that research for art making or filmmaking, which begins before a film is even conceived and doesn't end, in a sense, even when it has been made, is a form of second sight, redolent with all the intuitive, suprasensory, and associative turns of the phrase? What an artwork or documentary film can do is open for its audience the leaves of another aperture onto this world. It asks us to bring our situatedness in our world into contact and dialogue with at least two other senses of location, that of the filmmaker or the artist and that of the subject. Thus, it sets off a chain of refractions and resonances by positing one set of realities against other alternative realities. By asking us to look at the way someone looks at the world, a film or a work of art is only asking its viewer to look again at what he or she may have taken for granted. But this reiteration of vision is at a heightened and conscious level. In other words, witnessing a work of art or a film can, through its insistence on a double take on reality, make us aware of awareness itself. It can make us doubt, take pleasure in, as well as experience the intensification of that awareness. By framing the real, by holding the real in the custody of its images and sounds, the film or the work of art can disturb our deepest and most dearly held ontological certainties. However, can this disturbance not constitute the first step in a tentatively transcendent consciousness that yet remains rooted in the material and experiential everydayness of the world that it contemplates? I'm reminded of a work that I saw in this museum by the artist Park Chon-kyung, where a woman walking with a Geiger counter, the very everyday act of measuring radioactivity, which people have to do in many places in the world, then becomes a mode of thinking or being meditative about the fragility of life and material itself. And that's the relationship that I'm interested in, of things that you have to do anyway, becoming gateways to another form of consciousness. I was very happy to hear yesterday. I'm going to skip a little bit. I'm saying this to my champion hero friends, the translators, on whose hands I'm reliant. So occasionally I'm going to try and dance around the text, so please be patient with me. I was very happy to hear yesterday of the workshop project on Das Kapital that this year's Film and Video Art Forum has enabled. I liked both that you are paying attendance or attention to the Rux Media Collective's old friend Carl, and also to the world today, and that you are finding a modus of doing it collaboratively, of creating a commons for the work. I'll turn later, if there's time, to the question of the commons, but right now I want to think with you a little on the question of capital itself and what researching capital means. So it'll be a kind of second look at things. Some years ago, we were very preoccupied with the making of work that came to be known finally as the capital of accumulation. The title itself gives half the game away. We were working on that great echo, affirmation, and debate with Das Kapital in the Marxist tradition, Rosa Luxemburg's Accumulation of Capital. The work is an installation featuring a 50-minute-long video diptych accompanied by two vitrines containing an extant and an imagined book. It posits an oblique narrative concerning the relationship between the metropolises of Warsaw, Bombay, and Berlin, in counterpoint to Rosa Luxemburg's exceptional critique of global political economy, a book that she called The Accumulation of Capital. Our work is the capital of accumulation. I'm going to take 3 extracts from this work and use that to try and think about what research means. So it's a video diptych. What you will see are 2 screens. This is just for the purposes of a lecture. In reality, when it's shown as a work, they are part of an installation where the 2 screens are physically separated.
Courts tapered. The athletic excesses of the plan are abandoned. The Rosa Luxemburg electric light bulb factory grows derelict, awaiting redevelopment. The building acquires a new ecology. The market's invisible hand is a fractured limb.
Historically,
the factory turns into a suitable venue for undertaking new readings of the accumulation of capital. The undergrowth haunts my memory of production.
In which in this light it corrodes and assimilates. Thus capital cannot accumulate.
The stadium, a bowl full of inverted sky, becomes untended. A Vietnamese street market engulfs its perimeter. New life forms emerge in the undergrowth of informal exchange. Here now is the last international, a Babel reborn in Babylon. Vendors from Mozambique, porters from Iraq, Vietnamese cooks and North Indian waiters, Gypsies, Bosnians, Czechs, Ukrainians, Chinese, and even some Poles. A canopy of solidarities, a network of need. It sends tendrils shooting across the empty space of a failed dream, making it live to a different rhythm. You You can be thrown outside yourself when faced with the impatience of capital. Then every effort to return is an encroachment.
When she stood in Warsaw, on Marszałkowska Street, looking at the replica of herself, she had to think about how to stop life from turning to stone.
Rosa Luxemburg's Accumulation of Capital was a text that had a key heuristic role to play in the evolution of our own sense of the contemporary world. It was a part, and is still a part, of a collective self-education, our adventures in research and practice. When we were still students in university, and this was the days before the internet, when if you had to read something, you had to actually hold a book in your hands, and we wanted to have a reading group that read The Accumulation of Capital, and there were no books to be found easily in our libraries, so we got a book, typeset it, and printed it using our pocket money, and made about 500 copies and distributed it so that we could read it together. This was sometime in 1990. And I think it's that practice that became a part of the sort of archaeology of this work. So the Capital of Accumulation registers this move partly through the conceit of an imaginary eponymous book, which inverts the title of the original text, that is ostensibly being written by a fictional woman with the same name, with a name, Lakshmi Shorabgur, that reads as an Indian-sounding anagram, like a play with words, of the title Rosa Luxemburg, of the name Rosa Luxemburg. And in Warsaw, we found a statue of an Indian woman, which we said was Lakshmi Shorabgur. It was our, let's say, claim on an anonymous figure. Positioning the fictional Lakshmi Shorabgur in a temporal dimension that stretches backwards from now to the early 20th century allows us to reiterate Rosa Luxemburg's question about how capital continues to reproduce itself and to play with the possibility of several kinds of attempts at an adequate response. So we see a statue, and that's her, and we look at her again, and suddenly she seems to turn into something else. And that's what I mean by this kind of shamanistic second vision, the double look. Luxemburg answers the riddle of the missing body of the expanded reproduction of capital in the language of political economy by referring to the relation that capital has to its outside, to persisting pre-capitalist forms. We, on our part, were enabled by Lakshmi's fictional, numinous presence in the work to answer our queries partly in what we call the language of the birds. And I'll talk about this a little later. This allows us an elliptical, elusive commentary on three cities, Bombay, Warsaw, Berlin, on Luxemburg and her legacy, as well as on the possibility of a radical renewal that can take us away from capitalism. The language of birds is a term used in various esoteric traditions to describe a natural hermetic code of signs and auguries that were apparently the common medium of communication between birds, beasts, and human beings in the Garden of Eden before the fall. King Solomon, who can be regarded as a shaman sovereign, is said to have been given the ability to understand the language of the birds and a sense of the abundance of all things. In this sense, an adept at the language of birds is a person who has the ability to make meaning out of the mystery of the world and of nature. Why is this relevant to what I'm trying to say to you? In our research on the life of Rosa Luxemburg, we found that in her private life, she was a passionate student of botany and zoology and was consistently following birds and was a bird watcher. In fact, she would convene political congresses in the disguise of bird watchers' meetings. So it was a very interesting little twist and a turn where researching a life gives you a metaphor for thinking about coded forms of speech. For our purposes, we can take the language of birds to mean a vocabulary of practice that makes it possible to draw meaningful collections from amidst an eternal abundance of details. That's what research does and teaches you when you make documentary films. As if to name a cluster of objects or to make images of them were not merely to describe or list the things in themselves in an ordinal sense, that is, in an order of how they appear, but to create a cardinal web of connections between that object and their environment, between things and their affects, between shadows, mirror images, between information and mental states, between a body or bodies and a matrix of interwoven histories. When we began researching the project that would culminate in the capital of Accumulation, we had with us a supposition, a set of bare facts and a hunch.
Cemeteries mark the edge of cities.
Cemeteries mark
When you fall out of life, you fall out of the city. One way to understand the historical growth of a city is to see where cemeteries appear. They usually radiate outwards, like points on the rings of a tree trunk, in concentric circles from the historic center. Each epoch of city development adds another necropolitan notch along the radius of urban accumulation. The Friedrichsfelde Cemetery in Lichtenberg was not yet a part of Berlin in 1919. At the end of the 19th century, the mortuary of the Charité Hospital on Heimstrasse in Berlin was restructured along scientific lines to cope with the growing pressure of the unclaimed dead. For a while, it set the world standard for a bespoke, efficient, scientific tribute to the last stand of the unknown citizen. Separate facilities for the display, storage, and autopsy of cadavers were incorporated. Cold rooms created in the basement for keeping bodies that could not be identified. Ducts were sunk into walls and ceilings for the circulation of air. Hydraulic lifts were installed for the transportation of bodies, and channels dug on the floor for the draining of fluids. Vitrines were built for the exhibition of exceptional specimens. And still, the mortuary was overcrowded. This is where people came to search for a missing friend or relative. Standing in front of a glass-enclosed identification platform, they would see a body raised diagonally, the face uncovered. Up the stairs in a corridor stood an arched vitrine. For decades, this vitrine held an unidentified adult female torso. She was found in water and kept to demonstrate the effects of drowning on human tissue to students of forensic medicine. Professors duly noted, time of death unknown.
The body that was buried on the 13th of June 1919 as Rosa Luxemburg was definitely not her body, because if you look at the autopsy protocol from this year, you have no identification of this female as Rosa Luxemburg. On the opposite, you have a lot of hints that can't be her, so this was not Rosa Luxemburg buried there. We have a body that of a female that has the exact stature, the body proportions, and the height of Rosa Luxemburg. The isotope analyzer says this woman lived 90 years ago, in the time of Rosa Luxemburg. The computer tomography says this woman was between 40 and 50 years as she died. And we found with radiology and CT analysis a degeneration of the pelvic, and this body has no identification. So what is the reason to keep a body stored for 90 years without identification? The only explanation is she can't be identified because her identity, Rosa Luxemburg, was in a grave with another body.
Out of the 17 women's bodies fished out of the Langbier Canal in the spring of 1919, one woman's body stayed in the vitrine at the Charité. Another was buried in the Friedrichsfelde Cemetery. together with the body considered to be that of Karl Liebknecht. Once this body was thought to have been that of Rosa Luxemburg. Now, no one really knows for sure. Who was she? The Nazis disinterred and erased the body. The anonymous cadaver that had perhaps stood in bravely for the dead Rosa went missing again. A lost, missing person. The rumor, among students and staff at the Charité at least, was that Rosa never left the building. The vitrine is empty. The missing person has gone missing again. And then, Berlin swallowed Friedrichsfelde. The capital digested its outside.
We are all numbers today. A datum, a statistic, a measure. How many are we? How much of ourselves are we? How deficient or how much in excess are we? How liquid, how solvent, how current, how prolific? How dense, deep and dubious are we? What are we worth? How much do we weigh in with the world? What discount do we offer on ourselves? What is our rank, the percentage of our takings? How high is our perch, how deep our abyss, how shallow our grave?
How curious that there should be no contradiction between the urge to invade and the injunction against trespass.
There is another current, alternating, oscillating, interfering, turning the pages of time.
I'm going to skip 2.5 pages, right? But before I do that, what are the bare facts we begin with? We begin with a factory that has a name which is dead. The Rosa Luxemburg Electric Light Bulb Factory in Warsaw. We begin with a cemetery, a graveyard, which has a body which also has a name. The Rosa Luxemburg grave in Berlin. Actually, if you dig that grave, there is no body. It's a grave with a missing body. There is a body with no name inside a pathology department in a teaching hospital, where 2 doctors, the one that you saw, Michael Sokos, thinks that that is Rosa Luxemburg. So, we were confronted with the appearance of much more than a hitherto missing body. It was anecdotally known to us that Rosa Luxemburg, like many early 20th century intellectuals, regardless of a personally skeptical philosophical orientation, would occasionally amuse and entertain herself and her companions with planchettes and self-consciously ironic forays into the demi-monde of mediums and contact with the deceased. In a strange twist of circumstances, it was beginning to appear as if by embarking on our project, we had ourselves turned into mediums who occasionally received uncanny bursts of insight and communications from Rosa Luxemburg, relayed to us through the entirely imagined medium of Lakshmi Sorabgur, the woman we fictionally transposed into her alter ego, the sari-clad statue of an Indian woman in the precincts of the Salon of Congresses in the Palace of Science and Culture in Warsaw. But Rosa Luxemburg turned up to tease us in Berlin, and Lakshmi Sorabgur stood in front of us, of all places, in Warsaw. Somewhere around this time, we met an artist in Warsaw, a woman called Agnieszka Kurant, who happened to be a great grandniece of Rosa Luxemburg, as she told us at a dinner party. She suggested that we meet her grand uncle, Dr. Casimir Luxemburg, who at 97 years of age was still alive and lucid in Vilnius, Warsaw, Lithuania. She seemed to think that the forensic analyst in Berlin had been interested in his DNA. When we met him, he said he still saw her in his dreams in Warsaw. So the point was that we had found a herbarium, a book where Rosa Luxemburg collected plants. The forensic pathologist was interested to see if there was a strand of hair in that book. If they found the strand of hair, they would do a DNA analysis and connect it to the body. And if they found that it was the same strand of hair, then it was the same DNA, then it would be a match. However, no strand of hair was found. So they had to find a relative. And the only living person was this 97-year-old man whom we then met. Agnieszka Kurant told us that she would tell us the name and identity of her granduncle if she heard from Rosa Luxemburg, which was very curious because Rosa Luxemburg had been dead since 1919. But she said, well, she appears to me in dreams and I have chats with her. She had a chat with her great-grandaunt, telephoned us the next day and said, you can go and meet him. And that's what happened. I could pause here and quote to you a fragment that I found quite fascinating in a 17th century Korean novel, The Cloud Dream of the Nine by Kim Tanjung. I suppose you all read this in high school at some point of time. And the extract I have in mind is a moment when a wayward monk justifies his love for a woman who is a spirit. And he says, a man is a fool who is afraid of spirits. If a man dies, he becomes a spirit. And if a spirit lives, it becomes a man. A man who fears a spirit is an idiot. And a spirit who runs away from the living man is a foolish spirit. They all come from the same source. Why should we make a difference or divide the living from the dead? We're not here suggesting that there was anything really occult about the process of our research and the creation that this work involved. But we are aware of the fact that our encounters with the details that begin to accumulate in photographs, in letters, in archives, prisons, forensic laboratories, haunted, abandoned factory floors, and the streets of 3 cities led to the formation of several patterns. Other figures began to appear, sometimes like spirits. From a photograph kept in a vitrine in a silent watchtower in Berlin emerged the figure of an Indian prisoner of war who turned into a radical activist, turned into a film extra and an animal trainer. And all this was true. We found this in the research. We found out that there was indeed such people whom we speculated could become in our narrative someone like a man who really existed called Dada Amir Hyder Khan, also known as Hyder the revolutionarist, an Indian and later Pakistani sort of man of many parts who was active in several radical left and anarchist milieu in Europe and North America after the First World War, and who, it is said, had met Karl Liebknecht, Clara Zetkin, and indeed Rosa Luxemburg. So the reason why I'm saying all this is that all of these details appeared in the course of very meticulous research in archives. My hunch is you spend long enough time in archives, you begin to see ghosts and you begin to have conversations with them. And that's what turns research into a detective story, into a fable, into a fairy tale, and begins to haunt the process of making your work itself. Let's skip again. Thinking about capital, 2 more pages, can take us in other directions and to other questions as well. Let's skip this. It's a fragment from a very recent work of ours, again a longish film called Provisions for Everybody. So if we were interested in dead factories in the accumulation, in the capital of accumulation, we began being interested in what goes into factories, into materials itself. And Provisions for Everybody, this film, is a meditation on material. It's part of a whole series of works where we're interested in what happens when you look at extraction. This work is about coal and energy and fire, which is why this fragment says everything is burning, which is a fragment from a sutra of the Buddha, the fire sermon. In Provisions for Everybody, our attention turns to coal, fuel, energy, sustenance, scarcity, abundance, and doubt. In the course of making this work, we had to think about a lot of things. For instance, about the relationship between calories, energy, power, and the basic metabolic rate, which is fundamental to human life processes. We also thought about pigs, donkeys, and windmills. The work inscribes an eccentric itinerary on and off the trail of George Orwell, the famous writer who wrote 1984. We've been having a kind of conversation with Orwell for a while. Fragments from his remarkable early essay, Shooting an Elephant, turn into inscriptions on the pedestals of hollow, evacuated, and broken statuary of imperial presences in another work of ours, Coronation Park. Orwell offers a prescient diagnosis of the sickness of power, as relevant today as it was when colonialism held sway, and he was a colonial police officer when he started thinking politically. The conversation continues in a different vein in Provisions for Everybody. Aspects of this work began as a response to reading his remarkable and eccentric book, Road to Wigan Pier, which is a meditation on coal mining. How do we begin thinking about energy, fuel, and the calorific value of life processes? The Road to Wigan Pier shows us a very different Orwell from the one who writes 1984, which is the book that everybody reads. Here, Orwell has a much more down-to-earth, less dystopian, and yet more visionary sensibility. It is here that Orwell comes closest to articulating his own politics, especially when he says, "The world is a raft sailing through space with enough provisions for everybody." What strikes us here is the planetary clarity of the image of the Earth as a raft, as a vagabond in space, embarking on a journey carrying provisions. Ideas of the arc, of how different forms of life have to share the space and time of a voyage, of ballast and energy, provoked a whole new line of inquiry. Here, for instance, are a set of calculations that we began making while researching indices for the production of coal in the 20th century. A shadow of the presence of these calculations makes itself felt in the work. Here is an extract from the correspondence between us during the making of the work. So this is what Jibesh and Monica and I am writing to each other as notes from our research. The energy produced by a ton of coal, that is roughly 22 gigajoules, is equivalent to the energy required to maintain the basic metabolic rate of roughly 2,500 human beings. In the 1930s, when the Road to Wigan Pier was being written, the productivity of the average British miner was close to 300 tons of coal per year. That is 6,600 gigajoules of energy per year. That is energy equivalent to the amount needed to maintain the basic metabolic rate of 750,000 human beings. 900 wind turbines produce as much energy today as 13,750 British coal miners did in the 1930s. So you can see what we're doing. We're just constantly running calculations between us and passing those calculations around to each other to see what we mean. We get to the end of the calculations by saying you need 1,753,200 gigajoules if you were to produce the energy equivalent of more than 35 people billion to be at rest. There are roughly 7 billion people in the world today, and we might have to extrapolate to 30 billion in about 100 years. Windmills produce as much energy today as it would take to have roughly 5 Earth loads of people to be at rest. And yet we live in an energy-scarce world economy. The question of why so many people are exhausted when there is so much energy already being produced out of the air is not a question of technological limitations. There must be other reasons for the fatigue. It could be said that all of provisions for everybody is an attempt to wrap our head around these calculations. The implications of this calculation leads to a pervasive sense of astonishment and surprise. We travel between northern England, eastern India, where Orwell was born, Myanmar, Catalonia. We pause at Wigan Pier, where Orwell queried the future, at Motihari in Bihar, India, where he was born in the shadow of an opium godown, and on the road from Mandalay, where he began to understand the operations of force. But on the way, we found a place right next to where Orwell was born, where the Buddha delivered a sermon on doubt and the importance of asking questions. So the Buddhist maxim, everything is burning, turns into an allegory for the relationship between fuel, energy, power, and the conflagration of our times. That's what research does. It makes for strange connections. What does the consciousness of the essay film, which permits these connections to be made, do to our practice? Sometime in the late 1980s, there was a screening of Hartmut Betomsky's film, German filmmaker, The Autobahn of the Third Reich, at the Goethe Institute in Delhi. All three of us, Jibesh, Monica, and I, who did not know each other then, saw it on the same day. What we do remember is the feeling of being unmoored by the film's rhetorical stances from the compulsion of being within or outside any particular discipline. The same thing happened a few years later when we were in a workshop with Harun Farocki. He made thinking seem really hard. Harun Farocki is a filmmaker that I'm assuming many of you know. And he made thinking seem really hard work and making films seem really easy. The trick was to think and make films at the same time. What were they doing that we were so taken with? We can remember having several conversations about the space that created in their minds with their films. It was not the space of fact, nor was it pure speculation. It was not a slave to evidence or to fancy. They were reading archival images gathered from state and cinema archives, making new connections, using simple juxtapositions to cut through sedimented forms of viewing, and yet they were not the slave of the archive. It was from them that we learned how to listen to the ghost of Rosa Luxemburg when we went looking for her traces. I found a similar sensibility in the work of a young Korean filmmaker that we've had the pleasure and privilege to work with, and she's here in the audience somewhere, Jamin Cha, and a film Autodidact about a father who teaches himself forensics to try and solve his son's murder by the state. Filmmaking like this plays a series of subtle moves that displaces the knowledge that its viewer takes for granted. This means that the viewer has to think for him or herself to get to the place where the film pointed towards. At present, contemporary art allows for such an agility. It is today a space rife with conversation, in ferment, enriched by currents that emanate in diverse disciplines and practices. Artists, regardless of whether they define themselves as such, should never have to feel hampered by expectations, especially if these expectations threaten to appear in a consensual form, a form where we all agree this is what art or film should be like. Everybody should be free to develop and pursue the ghost stories in their own curiosities. Today, the situation has changed. It is no longer necessary for a person working independently with a moving image to work within the domain of what was called documentary for developmental purposes alone. Nor is it necessary for them to pursue the sort of vanities of experimental cinema. These are not the only available alternative languages to the universe of mainstream commercial image making and television. Today, relatively simple technological means make it far more affordable as compared to earlier, quite possible for a person to make films with their phone and to pursue a filmmaking practice or an image making practice that is completely up to their own purposes. Your phones are your cameras. You can edit your work on your own or your friend's laptop, circulate what you make on YouTube in video. This is no longer a phenomenon restricted to metropolitan cities, and as internet connectivity expands, we think we will begin to see a lot of interesting visual content from the hinterlands of our cultures. I don't know if TikTok is a phenomenon here, but in India, at least, it is changing what the image means. There is a viral impulse at work that creates a new economy and a new sociality of making and viewership. This means that artists and filmmakers working with the moving image can actually stretch the horizons of their practice in fundamental ways. We are no longer in the situation where people could wield an easy contempt for experimental cinema, or for that matter of contemporary art, saying, no one watches this kind of work. Everyone watches everything. So, and this is the right moment to ask, what does it mean to be anybody, everybody, nobody, antibody? What does it mean to be a collective? I won't give you an answer, but in conclusion, I will try a little mathematics or arithmetic, so bear with me. To be a collective is not enough to simply understand the arithmetic of being more than one, of being three, or many, or plural. And filmmaking is a necessarily more or less collective activity. Someone has to hold a camera, someone has to hold a microphone, someone has to hold or switch on the lights and hold a reflector. Many people are often at work trying to do one little thing. So what can this other idea of number be? Alain Badiou, a philosopher that I like reading, has a little book on mathematics, on number and numbers, and he asks, isn't another kind of number necessary in order for us to turn thought back again against the despotism of number, in order that the subject might be subtracted from it? Remember, in the Rosa Luxemburg film, we started with the problem of a missing body, a subtracted number, a minus sign. And that leads us to a meditation on what does it mean to be quantity, to be a number, to be counted, right? What can this other idea of number be? What is required is that everyday working through of a geometry of relationship such that work, artistic work in our case, happens in the angles formed by the linking of the arms of a figure. It's not through accumulation, to paraphrase accumulation of capital, but through the relationship that are at angularities to each other. In our specific case, this produces a triangulation which can be acute, oblique, or equilateral, depending on the circumstances. Any cones of any triangle can find mooring in any space that is prepared to receive their pointedness. Triangles can nest in figures shaped to receive them. Collectives can find anchorage in collectivities larger than themselves. I was asking Hafiz about their collective, and I realized that it's actually collectives nested within collectives, nested within collectives. And that's a relationship between quantity and the quality of relationships that I think is really interesting in the domain of contemporary art right now. The data sets that astronomers work with at present are so dense that they require collaborative linkages between thousands of people in different locations for us to begin making sense of them, which is why we've been working a lot with astronomers recently, and they tell us all the time that their work relies on amateurs spending time on their computers and doing data analysis for them. However, this collaborative imperative does not preclude the possibility of individual acuteness in insight around the same material. The same can be said about the times we live in. The complexity of contemporaneity is so multifaceted that we need a vast array of practices and sensibilities to be in sustained dialogue with each other in order to even begin making sense of where we are in culture today. Which is why there is that diagram of the conversation between the three computers of the Rux Media Collective that is a metaphor for, let's say, the sort of slightly absurd claim that we're making that we are listening to 7.5 billion people. Often, the signal to begin any movement, even a straightforward practice run, is the simple articulation of the first three numbers in the number line. 1, ready. 2, steady. 3, go. It is said that all accounts of the world can be simplified into a 3-step operation. Here lie the beginnings of mathematics, philosophy, performance, literature, and of every attempt to speculate about the world. There is me, 1, there is you, 2, and there are many, 3. 3 marks the beginning of plenitude, the escape from the prison of I and thou, self and other, into the world. 3 is the figure of our research practice. With the number 3, the first wild card, the first odd prime, our account of the world takes us out of the interlocked prison of the dyad of either opposition or reflection or echo. 3 is the key move as well as the option out of the treadmill of the dialectic. With 3, we begin to understand plurality and plenitude. To ascend the ladder of the calculus, it is with 3 that we begin to glimpse infinity and to realize that everything is burning. What other reason can there be for research or for creativity or for anything at all than having a little share of infinity, something that can never diminish even if you share it in infinite times? That is why we make art. That is why we do the research that is necessary for the making of art. Thank you.